So let me begin, first of all, by introducing myself. I'm Edward Herring, and I'm the first year coordinator for Ancient Classics. And I want to begin by welcoming you to NUI Galway and to thank you for your interest in coming to hear about what we offer in Ancient Classics and to find out whether it might be a suitable subject for you to study. So I'm going to now load up my PowerPoint. And there you should see that. So I've called the PowerPoint presentation Introducing Ancient Classics, and that's what I intend to do. We're not going to give you lots of technical information about modules and credits. I'm sure you've heard that at other sessions during the orientation week. I'm really going to talk about what Ancient Classics is, why it might be something that you find exciting to study, as we do, and also to give you a flavour of what we'll be studying with you, particularly in semester one. So it's very much focused on getting you started. Now, Ancient Classics isn't a topic that will be familiar to many of you. It's not a school subject in most schools in our catchment area. But there will be a certain amount of knowledge that you have in your own cultural background. It's not quite as unfamiliar as it sounds. So what is Ancient Classics? Well, it's the study of cultures, human cultures and societies rooted in the civilizations of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, both Mediterranean cultures, but it's wider than that. And as I say, you'll have a certain familiarity. The slide I'm showing on the first slide here has a person who you may well have heard of. The person on the slide is Alexander the Great, who was a Macedonian king in the 4th century BC. So what is Ancient Classics? Well, as I say, it's a study of civilizations that are rooted in the cultures of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, but we take a much wider view than that. So what I'll be covering today will be why you might find what Ancient Classics is, why you might find it interesting to study or exciting, why it might suit you as a person, as a student, and why you might find that it complements other subjects that you have an interest in. And then the second part of the presentation will be very much about, and the bulk of the presentation will be about what you'll be studying in the first semester. So, ancient Greece, ancient Rome. But as I say, we take a broader view, both in terms of geographical space, but also chronological time. We look back to the civilizations that helped shape the cultures of Greece and Rome, that influenced them, that inspired them, cultures that go back to the earliest cities in the world, which were over here in Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, and how civilization spread westwards. And then we have the first great European civilizations, first of all in the Greek Bronze Age, and then later in the first millennium BC in ancient Greece. And then the baton passes to Rome as Italian-based cultures begin to dominate. Rome, of course, had a great empire, it was a great imperial civilization. In fact, the slide that you're seeing is a map of the Roman Empire at its greatest extent. This is in about 117 AD, when just at the point when the Emperor Trajan, and as you can see, all the pink is the Roman Empire. It stretches as far as England and Wales and southern Scotland, Spain and Portugal, France, parts of Germany, all across North Africa, significant part of Egypt, into the Near and Middle East, Iraq, Iran, all up around by the Black Sea, and here in the Balkans, and of course the heartlands of the civilizations themselves, Greece and Rome, and the Mediterranean Sea, which they called the Mare Nostrum, our sea. They looked around that sea. So that's a great geographical spread. But we don't only look at these civilizations and where they came from. We also look at how they've continued to influence the modern world. We look at how knowledge from these cultures survived through the Middle Ages and beyond into the modern world. And because the classical world, the Greco-Roman world, are at the roots of European civilization, they still send echoes through our culture today. And that's really what my next slide is about. I say here that ancient classics, the Greco-Roman civilizations, offer the origins of European languages, writing, literature, mythology, theatre, history, philosophy, political thought. And the other things that I say I'm not going to mention. But let me just run through those points in order. Languages. The languages of the Greco-Roman world still influence our modern languages. They're the first languages that we have recorded, written down. But Latin is the direct ancestor of the Romance languages, of French, of Spanish, of Italian, and other languages like Romanian, Portuguese, etc. But even English, which is a Germanic language, something like 70% of English words have a Latin root. We also have lots and lots of words that are rooted in ancient Greek. So the origins of language, European languages, are in the ancient world. Writing. The earliest European writing goes back to the Greek Bronze Age, and the alphabet system of writing came into Europe originally from the Near East and then came into the Greek world in about the 8th century BC, and an adapted form of that script became the Roman script, which is what we use to write English or Irish. So the very first writing in Europe are from these cultures. And not only the first writing, but also the earliest literature. And in fact, once we have the alphabetic system of writing in the 8th century BC, the very first work of European literature written down is a Greek epic poem, and it's one of the masterpieces of world literature, the Iliad of Homer. So the very first works of literature, the very first masterpieces of European literature are from ancient Greece. Mythology, storytelling. One of the very distinctive features of particularly the ancient Greek culture is an incredibly deep and complex mythology. And they use this mythology to reflect upon what it was to be a human, and also to on the divine. And if you look at this image here, this is what's called a black figure vase, and it shows a mythological story. It's a story that many of you may well know, even though you might not have known it was an ancient Greek story. It's a story of Theseus and the Minotaur, a hero named Theseus from Athens who defeats and kills a monstrous creature that's half human, half bull, that lives on Crete. There are lots of mythological stories that you would have some familiarity with, even though you're not necessarily aware that they are classical stories. Theatre and drama. There'll be many of you who are studying theatre and drama or studying English. The whole history of European theatre begins in ancient Greece. And I've put a Greek theatre on the slide here. The conventions of drama are established in ancient Greece. That idea of not telling a story, but playing a story out visually. And the ideas, the very origins of how do you move a plot along? Well, you need argument. You need people to disagree with each other. You need someone who comes in who doesn't have information, who people will tell crucial information to, or someone who arrives with new information to advance the plot. All of these conventions are ancient Greeks. And indeed, our very word theatre comes from the Greek word theatron, which means the viewing place. History. How do we know about the past? Well, we know about the past through archaeology. We also know about the past through history. And the very first Europeans to write their history down, again with the Greeks, the very first surviving historical text we have is a text by a man named Herodotus. And he's often called the father of history, sometimes also called the father of lies, because some of his stories are quite fanciful. But the point about that idea of a society, a culture, writing about its own past, recording it, preserving it, those are all ideas that come out of classical antiquity. Some of you will be considering or are really keen to study philosophy. The word philosophy means love of wisdom, knowledge. Some of the key figures at the roots of European philosophy, people like Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, were all figures from ancient Greece. And indeed, they will figure in the study of philosophy, as well as being referenced in the study of ancient classics. Others of you will be very interested in politics. Maybe you've registered for sociological studies, political science. And of course, again, political thought throughout of the study of philosophy. Certain ancient philosophers, Aristotle, for instance, was extremely interested in constitutional development, so political thought. And in this little slide at the bottom, a very interesting idea from classical Greece. They show little potsherds, little broken pieces of pottery where somebody has written a name or more than one name upon them. And this was used for a kind of election, only it was a different kind of election than we're familiar with. In this one, they weren't voting for who they wanted in power. This was an election where you were voting to get rid of people, quite literally get rid of them. They were exiled if they won this election. And the way they voted was to write the name of the person they wanted exiled on the potsherd. And on these sherds, you can see names, some of which are among the most famous names from ancient Greek. And it is a very good idea, by the way. Ancient Greek history. Here, for instance, we see the name Pericles, who may be someone you've heard of, particularly if you follow British politics, where Boris Johnson quite often indicates his admiration for Pericles, even though who you admire and who you actually emulate don't always marry up. So all of these areas and many others have their roots in the Greco-Roman world. And this shows why ancient classics is such a good subject to complement other subjects in an arts degree, because we connect and we are at the origins, the wellspring of so much of what they pick up and study. But it's not just looking to the past, because the influence of Greco-Roman culture, classical tradition, is still very much with us and alive. And because European civilization spread first to the New World and has now spread in the globalized world across the world, we can see the echoes of ancient Greek culture all across the modern world. So, for instance, here's a very famous painting. It's The Birth of Venus by Botticelli. That's a Greek myth. Originally, Venus is the goddess of love. That's her Latin name. She's known as Aphrodite in Greek. And she was born from the sea. And this is what's being taken up as a theme by a Renaissance painter. And even a more recent example would be Ulysses by James Joyce. Ulysses is the Latin name for a Greek hero named Odysseus. And there's a surviving epic poem called the Odyssey, which deals with how Odysseus tried to make his way home, wandering across the Mediterranean, having a series of complex and difficult adventures, but finally getting home and meeting the challenges he had to meet when he got there. James Joyce, who had a good knowledge of the ancient world, took that idea and reimagined it in early 20th century Dublin, with the idea of his hero or his protagonist wandering around through Dublin, encountering different people, having these sort of adventures or episodes with them. So that's a work very much modelled in and playing with the concept of the Odyssey and reimagining it for the modern world. Just to then sum up this first part of the presentation about why classics might be interesting to study and why it might complement your other subjects. To just emphasize a few of the distinctive and complementary features, we take a long view of human society. We're not just looking at 100 years or 200 years of the history of a culture. We are looking at the entirety of these cultures, and we're looking at that creativity, stretching back to the 4th millennium BC, stretching forward as far as present, with our anchor in the civilizations of ancient Greece and Rome in the 1st millennium BC and the first half of the 1st millennium AD. So a very long view, deep view. There's also that great geographical breadth. Put here on the slide from India to Ireland in terms of the influences, the periphery of the classical world, of the Roman Empire, for instance. But actually, the spread is more than that, because Western culture, European culture has gone all around the world. So we are looking at that great spread, and we're looking at how these ancient cultures survived into and were changed, but also continue to influence our modern cultures. And we look at a variety of perspectives. Study literature, or we don't just archaeology, we don't just study history. We try to put all of these together. So we'll be looking at things like literature and mythology, art and archaeology. We'll be looking at political and social and intellectual history. We'll be looking at languages and linguistics and many more things. And we'll take all those different perspectives. So lots of variety of approaches, and also the challenge of how you reconcile evidence from different kinds of sources, put them together to create a holistic picture of these cultures. And I describe it as a challenge, and it is a challenge. And that's one of the things about being at university. You should be challenged by it. And so I'm now going to devote the next part of the presentation to the modules that we'll be studying in classics. And just to say, we're going to begin the first 2 weeks online. That's just as we set up the registration, settled down, and we know what the numbers are. Once we know the numbers for the big lecture modules in particular, we will be dividing you in and getting you onto campus for face-to-face sessions as often as we can. That might be there'll be 3 groups and you'll be getting 1 in 3. It could be different from that, but our best guess is 3 groups at the moment. Language modules will be running face-to-face from the start. So let's begin with CC 1101, Mythology and the City in Ancient Greece. It's a module with 2 strands. It runs in the first semester, and it has 1 strand devoted to mythology and 1 strand devoted to history. And the 2 eventually each other, and you'll see how they connect through the study of ancient society. But to talk of mythology first, what is mythology? Well, at a simple little level, these are stories, and entertaining stories, interesting stories, stories about gods and heroes. And so at the simplest level, they're entertainment. Stories that people would have listened to after they'd had their banquet. Or stories that these days we might tell the children. A bedtime story. But they're more than that, and they're deeper than that. If you look here at this detail from a vase, we see 2 figures opposed. We have here a very human-looking figure. Looks like a person. He's holding something there in his right hand. And very usefully, the vase painter has told us who he is. He's put his name by it. And this is Zeus, the king of the gods. And over here, fighting with, who's opposed, this monstrous figure, whose name is Typhon. And he has a wild red hair and beard. He's got donkey's ears. He's got wings, so he's not the sort of creature you meet every day. He's got these legs, instead of legs, he's got snakes. So he's something abnormal. And he's a giant, and he's a figure from wild imagination. So at a simple level, one can read that as an entertaining story of Zeus fighting a monster. Or it can be read as a story about order in the universe. Zeus, the one who looks like a human, is imposing the order of civilization on the chaos of the universe. Zeus becomes the king of the gods and rules and oversees divine justice in the universe. Or it can also be read as an allegory for power in the mortal world. Zeus is a surrogate for the king who can impose his order on disparate voices, on forces from outside who threaten our civilization, foreign powers that are at war, or dissenters from home who want to disrupt the social order. So again, it can be seen as an allegory for the benign power of the rulers of society. But another way of looking at it is, of course, here's Zeus with all his power. He's the supreme god, and he's going to smite this monster with his thunderbolts. Side of the dissenters, those who don't approve of the political power of the time, then Zeus became tyrant. And the ancients viewed these stories in all of those different ways. They constantly reworked these stories. They constantly reused them, reshaped them, and changed the emphasis depending on the needs of their time and what they were trying to convey to their audiences. The other slide, or the other picture on the slide, is a much older. It's a Near Eastern epic, which shows a figure attacking and killing a monster. And so you see some of the origins of those stories. The second part of this same module looks at ancient Greece. And I can see from the chat we're getting some questions about ancient Greece. This is modern Athens. And we look at a case study of Athens from the late 6th century BC to the later 4th century BC, not quite 200 years. And we begin with the establishment of a democracy. And again, this is one of the great legacies of the ancient world to the modern world. Now, democracy that they established, the democracy is a very radical democracy in that every citizen, everyone who had the franchise, could go to the assembly, could participate, could debate, could shape the decision making of the state. Every single one. So it's not like us where we vote every 5 years. This is one where they could go any day that they wanted and participate. So in that respect, it's incredibly democratic. But who was it who were the citizens? Well, women had no political rights. And this is a society that also had a slave economy. Slaves had no rights, no political say. And foreigners who lived at Athens, and there were plenty of those too, didn't have any say or political rights. So on the one hand, it's extremely democratic. On the other hand, from our point of view, it's not very democratic at all. Very soon into the history of the democracy, the ancient Greece face a threat to their freedom from the east, from a vast empire called Persia, based in modern Iran. And they invaded Greece twice. And then in the Athenians, though they twice had their city occupied by the Persians, eventually were part of a small coalition of states that managed to drive the Persians out. The Athenians, who had taken a lead, this gave them great confidence. You get a great cultural flourishing in Greece. The writing of the great plays, philosophy, art and architecture. They built wonderful buildings like the Parthenon here. And they proposed to the islands in the Aegean to protect them by joining together in a confederation. But pretty soon, that confederation goes from being an alliance of mutual defense to being effectively an Athenian empire. And so these Greeks, who love their freedom, are so proud of having defended their freedom and make a great thing of their autonomy, think nothing of not giving rights to the majority of the people who are actually in their communities. They also don't think anything of imposing their will upon their fellow Greeks, the citizens of other Greek states. Eventually, conflict breaks out within the Greek world, where Sparta and its allies fight the Athenians and their allies in a long war called the Peloponnesian War, that Athens eventually loses. And then for the 4th century, Athens spends much of its time trying to regain its period of preeminence, its position of preeminence in the Greek world, but doesn't really ultimately succeed because the Macedonians take over. So those two parts of the module, where we look at history and we look at mythology, and we also look at society in classical Greece, that's how they come together through the study of society. And so that gives you a good grounding in Greece 5th century. Another module we have is one that runs across the academic year. It runs in both semester 1 and semester 2. It's called Written Words and Spoken Languages. In semester 1, it's focusing particularly on the written word. Semester 2 on the spoken language. Writing is one of those revolutions in human thought, human culture. Once you can write things down, you can preserve them. So we look then in this module at things like the technology of writing and how it changes worlds, how oral societies are different from written societies, and how, again, societies where there is writing, but also much of society is oral, again, are different. And we'll be looking at things about like the transmission of texts. When we study one of these ancient texts from Greece or Rome, we get a book and we can look at it, and we can read it either in translation, or if we know the languages, we can read them in the original. How does that survive to us? How do we have it? And how do we know that we can trust things like those sources that have come to us, and trust that they're an accurate record of what was originally written down? How do we know what we know? How do we know, can we trust what we think we know? In the second half, you'll also be looking at the history of languages, but don't worry if you're not terribly linguistically oriented. This is it's not a language module per se where you'll be learning in the language. You won't need to have detailed knowledge of languages. It's showing you the connections between languages and looking at how those languages are connected through a common ancestry. Another year-long module we have, which runs across the 2 semesters, is Classics in 20 Objects, which does exactly what it says on the tin. You study classics through the study of 20 individual objects. These are some of the ones you will study here. Others are just illustrations of objects from antiquity. All of the classics team contribute to the teaching of this module. Each week there'll be a different object, and you learn about that object. You learn about how it was made, when it was made, where it was found, and particularly what it tells us about the ancient world. And this module we use as a way of trying to show you something of the breadth of classics, taking objects from all over the world and through long periods, different periods of time. So you get a sense of the breadth, you get a sense of the range of techniques and approaches that we use to study the past. And also, what we're trying to convey is the way in which we pictures, reconstructions of the past. If you think about this, we're talking about cultures here that are 2,000, 2,500 years ago, and so much of the information has been lost. The vast majority of the information from the past has been lost. So we have to have every scrap of evidence we can and extract from that as much information as we can, and then combine that with all the other scraps of information to create a picture of the past. And so this is to show you how objects, both wonderful objects, monumental objects like temples or statues, but fairly everyday objects like pottery or simple documents, can enhance and contribute to our understanding of the past. Now, in classics, we are different from most other first art subjects in that we offer you some choice in your modules. And some of you may well be good at languages, enjoy languages, or have a particular desire to learn one of the ancient languages. And then one of the beauties of learning to translate on the ancient languages is that you're then engaging very directly with the thoughts and creativity of ancient people. You're understanding them through reading their own words, not somebody else's translation and interpretation of their words. And learning an ancient language is not like studying a modern language, because obviously there's no spoken element to this. You are learning to translate, essentially, learning to read in those languages. The slide, this is it's a metal with a Greek inscription on it. Greek sometimes scares people because they see the script and it looks different from modern script. But don't be put off by that if it interests you, because it doesn't take long to learn the script. It's actually very closely related to the Roman script, and it doesn't take very long. An hour's study will get the names of the different letters and the phonetic values of the letters in your head. And there's a lot of things that are actually familiar. For instance, you can see here, there's a letter there that looks like an A. Well, that's alpha, and it's pronounced A, so it actually is an A. Likewise here, this thing that looks like an E is an epsilon that is pronounced E, so it is an E. So lots of them are actually more familiar than you think. And then over here we have a Roman gravestone with a Latin inscription on it telling us about the person who's died, and also quite nice images of these people who in lockdown were unable to get their hair cut, as you can see. So we have the opportunity to study languages, either Latin or Greek, starting from beginner's level. That might be for you, it might not. You're not obliged to study it, or either one of them, but you can try either one of them if you like. If it's something that appeals to you, but you think to yourself, oh, I'm not sure I want to do that in first year, but I'm just getting used to being at college, there will be other opportunities. You can pick up the study of the languages at the start of second year if you continue to study with a degree level, or at the start of third year. So this is not the one-time only offer, but if you are seriously interested in language study, linguistics, or reading text in the original language, then you can make a start on that in first year. I'm not going to talk about very much about semester 2, but one of the core modules in semester, or key modules in semester 2, is a study of empire and literature in ancient Rome, looking at Rome as an imperial city and the way it presented itself through literature, and sophisticated literature looks back to the origins and heritage of Rome, but also does a sophisticated way where it also talks about the price that's paid for empire. So Rome's greatness is celebrated, but also the fact that individuals and other cultures pay a heavy price for Rome's imperial greatness. Also, written words and spoken languages continues through semester 2, as does classics in 20 objects. And if you've done, say, beginning Latin 1 in semester 1, you can take beginning Latin 2 in semester 2 if you're continuing to enjoy that and do well with it. So there are options. Okay, that's what we do. As my colleagues have been saying via the chat, for the first 2 weeks, the lecture modules, Mythology and the City, and written words and spoken languages, and classics in 20 objects will be taught online. And then we will divide you into groups, and we'll start to see you face to face sometimes, while continuing to post online content for when it's not your turn. You'll be in groups. If you want to find out more about ancient classics, do feel free to email me, Edward Herring, at edward.herring@nuigalway.ie. Check out our website, where there's lots of information. There are some little videos on there that you can watch about what classics is. And there's also our student handbook and timetables and so on. You can email the general classics email address. And you can try things out. Don't forget, you don't have to finalize your registration immediately. I'm going to stop the presentation at this point. My colleagues and I will stay on the chat facility, so we can continue to answer questions via the chat facility after the presentation. But for now, all that remains for me to do is to say thank you for listening this morning, and I hope that you will have a really great experience in your 3 years at NUI Galway. Thank you very much.